opposes the death penalty for homosexuality. The others, in case you're wondering, are Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iran, Somalia, United Arab Emirates, and then parts also of Nigeria and Malaysia. So by the time Hassan managed to get on a flight, he did know somebody who was able to help him get on a flight out of the country. There were wanted posters in the airport with his name on them. So not surprisingly, when he got to New York, he lay very low. Far from Mauritania, another client, and again, I'm not breaching attorney-client privileges, I should say here very clearly, so I'm giving you a bit of an amalgamation of people. But another of our clients, Rosa, had been growing up in Peru knowing that she was a lesbian. No death penalty for lesbians there, but she nonetheless also had a brutal childhood. Extreme violence from family, from school peers, sanctioned by teachers. And like Hassan, she left her small town and moved to a bigger city, but she too could not escape the violence. She did have a girlfriend. She had something of a social life. She had a few gay and lesbian friends. But in a country that, for very strong religious reasons and cultural reasons, a woman unattached to a man, unattached as an adult woman without a husband, is in some danger generally. There's a strong expectation that women will marry, that they will not go through life single. So Rosa was repeatedly in danger. And the threats got so bad, there were attacks. She went to the police finally for some help. And she did this more than once, occasionally with some of her gay male friends. And not only were they mocked, and not only did the police stand by when they were actually right in the middle of the street, broad daylight, being attacked, but at one point the police told her, just marry your assailant, and then you will stay out of trouble. You won't be harmed anymore. Right? I could tell you very similar stories about our transgender client from Mexico or any of our other clients, or really, honestly, many LGBT people who come to the United States and seek asylum. But instead of more stories, I want to ask you to think about a question. And here's the question. So why, even with these experiences of persecution, should these individuals be able to seek refuge in the United States? Right? Usually people can immigrate to the United States. I don't know how much you know about immigration, but there are two main ways you can immigrate to the United States. One is if you have a family member who's here and they sponsor you, and that's where, you've heard of the stories about green card marriages and all, and we could talk about that if you're interested. But you have either a blood relative or a relative by adoption, or so you marry a U.S. citizen or a green card holder. And the other way is through employment. You have a job that's willing to sponsor you. So why should people who have neither of those connections to the U.S. be able to come here? The answer to this question comes in several steps. So let's start by going back over 50 years to 1951, right? Where after World War II, there are refugees streaming around the world trying to find a place to go, and there's no international agreement about what should happen with all of these people who have been uprooted from their homes. The United Nations stepped in and enacted something called the Convention relating to the status of refugees. And that was focused specifically on people who had become refugees after the war. What should happen? But the question had to be figured out, who is a refugee? Right? Who fits this status? Because not everybody was trying to leave their home countries because they had been displaced, and not by war or by virtue of having been attacked because of their identity. Right? Some people wanted to leave for better economic opportunity elsewhere. Some people wanted to leave because they were, in their 20s and they wanted to get out of where they were and go to a new place and experience a different part of life. So what is it? How do you home in on who is a refugee and who is not? So let me tell you what the UN said, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit. A refugee is a person who is outside of their home country, so they've already wound up in another country, and they are unable or unwilling to return to their home country because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution. And not just any kind of persecution, but persecution on account of one of 5 characteristics or categories. right? Race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And so that's the basis of refugee law, pretty much around the world. But that law, that UN convention, really only applied to people who were refugees 1951 and before. And as you know, the flow of refugees and the conditions that give rise to refugees, war, deliberate attacks, didn't stop after 1951. So the United Nations incorporated this definition of refugee into another agreement, a protocol relating to the status of refugees in 1967. The United States signed on a year later and said, okay, we agree, we will accept refugees, but didn't really do much of anything about it in the law until 1980, when it finally passed the Refugee Act, which brought the U.S. into compliance with its commitment under the United Nations. And the United States Refugee and Asylum Law is basically what I just said to you. A person has to prove that they have a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, national origin, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Okay, so that's the basics, but surely the United Nations, when it enacted its definition of refugee, and even the United States, when it enacted refugee law in 1980, did not have in mind lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender asylum seekers. Right? That's just not who they were thinking about. So how do we get to LGBT asylum seekers or LGBT individuals being able to obtain asylum in the United States through the refugee law? So you remember the one of the 5 characteristics or bases on which you could get refugee status in the U.S. was membership in a particular social group. That had been understood at the time of the refugee law's enactment as something of a catch-all phrase, because there were groups of people who didn't fit race, religion, political opinion, and national origin, but still had been targeted based on their identities in ways that the United States and internationally through the United Nations, the countries were committed to providing some protection, some asylum. So over the years, the question was who's in and who's out, right? What are the characteristics that get you into that group? And it's actually really interesting if you look at who has applied for relief as a member of a particular social group over time. The basic idea was that the characteristic that identified the group membership had to be something that either could not be changed or should not have to be changed, right? So what does it mean? It could be an aspect of identity that is physically not easily changeable, right? Which could be something like having a particular kind of disability. It later on understood to be having HIV or AIDS or some other sort of illness or disease that in that particular country is so profoundly stigmatized that it could be the basis for persecution. It could be something that's really, really different, connection to a family that has come into disfavor, right? So it's not maybe your political opinion that leads you to be persecuted, but your connection to this family, right, to a former politically leading family. That could be the basis for persecution. It could be something that isn't changeable by way of reputation, like your leadership of a labor union, former leadership of a labor union even. And so in the late 1980s, a gay Cuban man was the first, as far as we know, to seek asylum based on his membership in the particular social group of homosexuals, as he identified it. And quite surprisingly, I think, looking back, the Board of Immigration Appeals, which over time has, in my view, sometimes showed quite a lot of hostility toward asylum seekers, actually granted his application. They granted it that he was granted something called withholding of deportation rather than asylum, but the point for our purposes is that they recognized that he was a member of a particular social group and that he had been persecuted on that basis, and that the basis was his being gay, which in the 1980s, I don't know if you've studied about Cuba in the 1980s or seen the movie Strawberry and Chocolate, I think it's called. If you haven't, I encourage you to see it. It's a rendering of some of how gay people were treated in Cuba around that time. this particular man was quite brutalized. The Board of Immigration Appeals granted his asylum application, and then in 1994, but that was just him. In 1994, the Attorney General of the United States, Janet Reno, who was under Bill Clinton, serving under Bill Clinton, said this decision in this case called Toboso Alfonso is precedent. What does that mean? It means that it has a lasting importance. It means that the U.S. has formally recognized that seeking asylum based on sexual orientation or fleeing persecution for on sexual orientation grounds can be the basis for somebody remaining in the United States. And since that time, several United States courts of appeal have held similarly that if you're gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, well, there haven't been the transgender cases at the Court of Appeal, but basically that you can seek asylum on this ground as a member of a particular social group. There has not been the same formal development of the law based on gender identity or transgender status. Why? I think the reason is just that, the cases are newer. There have been fewer cases to make their way up through the pipeline. But at the lower levels of the system, transgender people, including my clinic's transgender client from Mexico, are sometimes able to win their asylum applications. There's one other category, very limited recognition, but I think there's a push to gain more for people who are intersex. That's an identity that maybe people are less familiar with. I don't know how much you talk about intersex identity on campus, but there's much to be said, but what I'll just say here is if you're not familiar with intersex condition, it's a condition and it's really a word that stands in for an array of conditions that lead somebody's anatomy not to be easily identified as male or female. In case you haven't really thought about this much, imagine what it would be like if you couldn't characterize yourself one way or another. This is obviously something that trans people face, but for intersex people, it's something that's a challenge from really infancy before there's a formal ability to articulate an identity, because it's a challenge that provokes doctors and it provokes parents, and happy to talk more about it, but I just mainly for our purposes here want to make sure you're aware. So that's step 1 or 2 or 3, right? Who is covered by asylum law? But then there's another question we have to ask. What does persecution mean? How bad does it have to be? So I want to say something else before I actually respond to that question. I want to give you 2 more wrinkles in the law that you might want to know about. First of all, did you know that gay people were formally excluded from entering the United States? How? U.S. law forbid entry, not people who were U.S. citizens, but people who were not U.S. citizens were formally barred from entering the United States under part of an American immigration law that excluded people with psychopathic personality disorder. Now, the term wasn't defined, and the term actually changed names over time in the history of the immigration law, but it was a term that was then handed over to the Public Health Service, which was charged with deciding who was in and who was out under this law. So who was in and who was out? Well, gay people were deemed to have a psychopathic personality disorder and were excluded. And in fact, there are documented histories of people trying to come into the United States and being excluded for that reason. Now, eventually, in the last decade of the law's existence, or of the gay people being excluded under this law, the Public Health Service was really not very interested in excluding gay people, and you had to actually go to quite great lengths to get yourself excluded for being gay. But nonetheless, this was the state of the law. How did it get changed? In 1990, are you familiar with Congressman Barney Frank? Openly gay congressman, he's in his last term, he's from Massachusetts. This is a little short lesson in political leadership, right? One of the things he did in Congress was to get himself onto the Immigration Committee, dealing with immigration legislation, and which meant dealing with lots and lots of immigration issues, but part of what it meant was that he was involved in a rewriting of a lot of the United States immigration law, and in the course of that, he removed the exclusion. So the exclusion was no more, but not until 1990. The other wrinkle that I want to mention to you that you are probably aware of is that the U.S. also banned people from entering the United States if they had HIV. which meant that if you were going through customs and the customs or immigration officer saw HIV medication in your bags, you were excluded, you were sent home. And this happened to people repeatedly, to the point that there was all sorts of advice floating out in the world and through networks about putting your HIV medication into an aspirin bottle and doing all sorts of things to make sure that the government would not know while you were trying to enter the United States that you had HIV. And in fact, because we had this HIV ban, we did not have a major AIDS conference in the United States, a major global AIDS conference in the United States from 1987, the time the ban was enacted, until it was lifted. Do you know when it was lifted? Last year. Oh no, I'm sorry, last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, 2009. It's a pretty long time. Every major public health official and organization, including the World Health Organization, condemned the ban, said there was no basis in public health for this, but that is what we had in place until President Obama ended it in 2009. Okay, but let's go back to our question. So what does persecution mean in asylum law? What has to have happened to you? So let me, and how do we even think about the question when there's no shortage of anti-gay violence in the United States, right? And I think especially in the wake of the Matthew Shepard killing, I assume you're all familiar with that, right? You said, well, this country can be a pretty disastrous place for gay people or LGBT people. Why think of this as a refuge? So the short legal answer is that there are two kinds of persecution that count for purposes of asylum. The first is the persecution perpetrated by government. So imposition of the death penalty is at the extreme end of that, of course, but it's not just the death penalty, and I'll talk a little bit about what else it might be in a few minutes. And the second is persecution that the government is unable or unwilling to control. So when the government refuses to provide protection, for example, against skinhead or other organizations that deliberately target LGBT people, right? Or in the case of our Peruvian client, right? Or really almost any of our asylum clients that I've mentioned to you, where somebody goes to police and says, we need protection, right? Or our home has been invaded, or I've been attacked on the street, and the police refuse to do anything at all, and sometimes exacerbate the violence. So, for example, just thinking about the first government-imposed violence, so President Ahmadinejad of Iran made a statement just last night, it was put on CNN last night, reiterating, affirming what he had said a couple of years ago at Columbia University, that about the sort of problems that gay people cause in society, and statements like that, and an official state-sponsored commitment to getting rid of gay people would be evidence, say, for example, that an Iranian gay asylum seeker would use to try to bolster his case or her case. As would data showing that gay people in Jamaica and Honduras, for example, also in Brazil, are subject to an stunningly high rates of anti-gay violence that the government does little about. And in fact, at least when we handled the case for our Brazilian client, Brazil had the highest murder rate of gay people anywhere in the world without adequate police response. And so what else does persecution look like in addition to what I've just described? Right, so for our clients from Uzbekistan and Brazil, it did mean skinhead gangs targeting gay people that the government was, encouraging, that police officers sometimes participated in, or that were acting with the tacit support of the government. In Uzbekistan, it also meant, as it does in many places in the world, a culture of police extortion, right? Either you pay me, or I arrest you for being gay. And any place where there is a law in place that forbids people from being gay or forbids gay people from engaging in sexual intimacy, that's a potential point of exploitation, and it happens quite a lot. In fact, if you go onto the website of the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, known as IGLHRC for short, I think they did a report that specifically highlights this trend of extortion around the world. For our trans client from Mexico, it meant much of what I've described, as well as police officers actively perpetrating violence. Sometimes the question of what is persecution is a little bit more complicated. So let me tell you here a story about my first asylum client, actually, a Russian lesbian, a lesbian from Russia. This was in the early 90s. Her name was Alla Picherskaya. She was living on the West Coast, and she decided to apply for asylum. And actually, let me give you a little, as we would say in the law school, maybe you guys say this a lot here, but let me just footnote something there and tell you about something a little bit different, and then go back to my text. The footnote is that now, if you live, when you're seeking asylum in the United States, you have to apply for asylum within the first year that you're in the United States. It's called the 1-year deadline rule. What does that mean? That within a year, you have to, first of all, understand that as an LGBT person, you can apply for asylum in the United States. You have to be willing to tell a government that you're gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. You have to then figure out how to fill out the forms and start the application process. For most people who have fled sexual orientation or gender identity persecution, who have been traumatized, who are living with the after effects or the current effects of post-traumatic stress, it's just not happening, right? I mean, it is not something that most people think about when they flee, unless they are connected up to a community of people who let them know that this is a possibility. And although some people are, most people are not. And so the question is, well, what does somebody do, right? And the answer is that most people wind up hearing this and going underground, not applying, living undocumented just as a way to survive. Some people take the risk and they apply anyway. There's one exception, or one major exception to this 1-year deadline rule that can be helpful for some LGBT applicants. It's called, you have to be able to show that you have extraordinary circumstances, essentially. There's a very, very good reason why you missed your deadline. And it turns out that one of those very, very good reasons can be post-traumatic stress, coupled with, post-traumatic stress, but how do you show that, right? If you're in the United States as a refugee, chances are you don't have a job, or at least a job that's going to pay you enough money to be able to access health care and mental health care. Most people are concerned with just finding a place to live, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So what are you supposed to do, right? What really most often happens is that people then come to their asylum interview 5 years later. They've just heard that they can do this somehow. They met somebody who knew somebody who told them something about this. And they have to find a way to get treatment, to get documentation from a doctor. They can just tell the asylum officer, well, here are my symptoms and here's what I've been experiencing. Here's why I couldn't apply. But that only goes so far. So unless the person, the applicant has an advocate, like they do when my students represent them through the clinic, or if they have a lawyer, it's very, very hard to win an asylum case. And I'll just footnote to my footnote and say it's very hard to win an asylum case anyway. Not because people don't suffer persecution, but because unless you have a lawyer or an advocate who understands how to represent people and assist them in the system, it just becomes a very difficult thing. And let me talk about that a little bit more later and go back to my text and talk about Alla Picherskaya. So when she was living in Russia, she was trying to be out as a lesbian, which is quite something in the 1980s. And she had a girlfriend and eventually, like I said, came to the United States. They went to San Francisco and she sought asylum. She put in her application, she explained why she was afraid of persecution in Russia. Why was she afraid? Because what Russia did at the time, as keeping with the Soviet history, was to threaten to, and sometimes actually to forcibly institutionalize lesbians and gay men in psychiatric institutions. Forcibly treat them with electric shock, involuntarily administer drugs, sort of mind-altering drugs. And so when she put all of this in her asylum application, and it was rejected. And so she appealed her case to the Board of Immigration Appeals. That's where I first got involved. And a colleague and I went and argued her case in Washington and Virginia, actually, where the board was at the time. And we, brought all this evidence and tried to make as compelling arguments as we could. And you know what the board said? The board said that wasn't persecution. Why do you think? Because the Russian government was trying to cure her, not harm her. And it was not for U.S. law to say that other governments couldn't provide, in effect, health services however they chose fit. So what are you supposed to say to something like that? Right? I mean, because on the one hand, you could say, oh, well, it's very culturally imperialistic to say that we should say how other countries should provide mental health care. On the other hand, and this is where human rights principles come in, there is the idea that sexual orientation is so fundamental to identity that whether it is physically or genetically immutable or not, it is not something that the government should require anybody to change. So that was our argument, but how do you persuade judges who haven't thought about that a lot? And again, we were there in front of the Federal Court of Appeals in the early 90s. It just wasn't, gay issues were not as discussed. That's the discussing kind of disgust, not the disgusting kind of disgust. They were not so much in the air as they are now. So what did we do? Well, we did what you always do, or what you often do in legal argument, which is that you argue by analogy. And we thought, well, what is going to be persuasive? So one that will address this kind of concern about shouldn't the government be able to do what it wants to do to save people? And so we took as one of our arguments the analogy of burning non-believers in Inquisition, right? To say that, look, they're the countries that were responsible for burning people at the stake, right? To, in effect, cure the non-believers, to save their souls, something arguably even more important than saving their mental health, right? Everybody agrees that today would be considered persecution. There are some things that we don't do to people in a society, right? We don't involuntarily administer electroshock or mind-altering drugs to change somebody's sexual orientation. Importantly, we won that argument at the Ninth Circuit, and I think that was a bit of a tide changer in terms of another affirmation that, yes, gay people fleeing persecution could obtain refuge in the United States. So when I started doing this work at that time in the early 90s, the situation was pretty bleak on a lot of fronts. First of all, nobody knew whether government would accept LGBT asylum seekers. I mean, there was that Toboso Alfonso, the gay Cuban case that I mentioned, but before 1994, that was just one case. We could, hold it up and argue it to courts, but it didn't really bind a court to do anything. There was a little bit of a trickle of news that Canada, Australia, some Scandinavian countries, some other European countries were starting to recognize asylum seekers who were fleeing sexual orientation-based persecution, but it was a different world from now. It was really a trickle. And in my world, which is partly a world of law review articles, there wasn't a single article out there about this issue other than actually one that I wrote a long time when I was just starting out to do the work. And part of the reason that somebody might write an article like that, or maybe that I was thinking about writing an article like that, is that then the lawyers who are arguing these cases have something to cite. Say, look, okay, we don't have a lot of cases, but look, there are these law review articles that say this or that address this particular issue. What else? There were no organizations out there that were specifically focused on helping LGBT immigrants or refugees, right? So there were certainly plenty of lesbian, gay, and bisexual focused organizations in the beginning of the 1990s. I'll tell you from my own experience, not a lot of transgender focused organizations. Indeed, Lambda Legal, where I worked for 10 years, started focusing on trans issues probably mid-90s, but really not significantly until in the 2000s. Same with other organizations. Immigrants, not a lot of thought. So maybe an LGBT asylum seeker could go to an immigration organization, but what do you think they meant there? A lot of hostility, a lot of homophobia, a lot of transphobia, a lot of, who are you, what are you, I don't understand this, but, or in a benign, more friendly way, well, I'm not really sure how to handle your asylum case. Maybe we will file an application for you. What would you say this is, like a political opinion, or do you have any religious views? But there was an understanding across the group of immigration organizations and lawyers that somebody could even attain asylum this way. Right? It was something that was really sort of limited to knowledge, limited to really a small group of lawyers and others who are interested in GLBT issues. And there was also not the internet in the way there is now. So the ability to access information was completely different. So where are things now, right? Much of the world remains very hostile to LGBT people, right? That's no surprise, I'm sure. But we've also seen a sea change in terms of what can be done for people, right? What sort of exists. So just this past March, and I still find this amazing, the United States Department of Homeland Security, through its Office of Immigration and Citizenship Services, launched a full training program with guidance for adjudicating lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender asylum cases. And asylum cases for intersex people. Right? This is really an extraordinary shift, because part of what it means is that if an asylum seeker goes into an office and doesn't really have anything, doesn't have an advocate, doesn't have anybody to help them prepare their evidence or really help them articulate their claim, the asylum officers, who are the first sort of the entry point for many asylum seekers, know something about this, can ask questions, have had training. And I guess maybe here I'll just mention that in the early 90s, when I started doing this work, we would sort of beg the asylum officers to let us come in, offices to let us come in and do training. And so eventually, two of them, there aren't very many around the country, but there happened to be one in New York on Long Island and one in New Jersey. They let us come in, and I remember going to the one in New York and giving a training. And first of all, several people were very welcoming to me, and about half the asylum officers just did not even want to look at me or hear a thing of what I was saying. And of course, there were no Blackberries and iPhones then, so they couldn't just read their email while I was talking. But it was the functional equivalent. People did not want to hear it. Other people really, really did, because they knew they were getting gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender asylum seekers, and they didn't know what to do. Right? How do I judge credibility? Because the primary job of the asylum officer is to figure out, is this person telling the truth? And so what you were having at that time were a lot of asylum officers asking people about their sexual practices. And when you think about it, try to put yourself in the shoes of a gay or lesbian refugee. You fled persecution somewhere, right? You've been attacked because of your sexual orientation. You have done all you can to bring yourself into this other government office and actually admit you're gay and ask for asylum on that basis, and now somebody's asking you about your sexual practices. So one of our jobs at that time was to say, actually, that's not really what you need to do to assess somebody's credibility. You can ask them, did you ever, sort of, do you have any gay friends? Right? What are their names? What do they look like? Did you ever go to a gay bar or organization, or, in the New York area, the Gay Community Center? Where is it? What does it look like, right? Just basic questions that are the sorts of questions that they would ask if they were trying to assess somebody's credibility for purposes of assessing a race-based claim or religious or political opinion claim, to just, again, get at what was the truth there. Finding out about who somebody had sex with or how often or how or whatever they did was not going to tell them anything more. That doesn't happen anymore. I should say that doesn't happen frequently. So we have the United States Department of Homeland Security with this policy in place. You can Google it and find it. that explains how officers should handle these claims. One other remarkable thing, the United States did this in collaboration with Immigration Equality, which is an organization, and you should also check that out if you're interested, that focuses specifically on the immigration needs of LGBT and HIV positive people. As Amit said, it's an organization I helped found a bunch of years ago, and it focuses on 3 issues. Right? One is the HIV ban, which is now gone. Another is the issue of asylum for LGBT and HIV positive asylum seekers. And the third is the issue of binational couples. What's that issue? That issue is just, again, parenthetically or in a footnote or a distant footnote because it's not exactly related to our topic, but it's the challenge for people who are not from the United States, let me put it this way, for U.S. citizens or green card holders who, if they fall in love with somebody from another country, are able to sponsor that person and bring them to the United States, unless the person is of the same sex, and then, thanks to the Defense of Marriage Act, that their loved one is treated as a legal stranger, and they may not bring them here. So, as a U.S. citizen, you could bring a fiancé to the United States, so long as you have a commitment to marry, and so long as they're of the other sex. Not so if you're gay. So that is the other issue that the organization works on, and I'm happy to talk about that. But going back to immigration equality for a moment, right? Not only is immigration equality working with the government on this guidance, but it is also a resource bank now for asylum seekers as well as for immigration organizations that don't specifically focus on LGBT issues to give basic training, right? So that, to give this sort of 101, who are gay people, what does transgender mean, as well as the level 201, how do we best bring together the materials to prove these cases. At the international level, the change is also striking. Just this month, the United Nations, through the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, issued a very long new report called Born Free and Equal, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity in Human Rights Law. It's another really interesting thing to check out if you're interested in the law, because it contains a compilation of all relevant human rights protocols on sexual orientation and gender identity issues. It also details some pretty grim persecution of LGBT people around the world, and as well as, of course, positive changes. And it makes the point that human rights commitments apply to all people, something that we might take as somewhat non-controversial in this room, but that much of the world doesn't take in the same way. So Navi Pillai, who's the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, wrote the foreword to the report, and in the foreword she said, "The case for extending the same rights to LGBT persons as those enjoyed by everyone else is neither radical nor complicated." It rests on 2 fundamental principles that underpin international human rights law: equality and non-discrimination. And she went on, "The opening words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are unequivocal. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." As many of you are likely aware, this principle, what Navi Pillai articulated there, has become a standing principle in United States foreign policy for the first time. Last December, Hillary Clinton addressed the United Nations in a speech widely found on YouTube, as well as on the State Department website. And she focused her remarks, it was remarks in support of International Human Rights Day, and for the first time ever, a senior level official from the United States stood before the UN and gave a speech about LGBT human rights. And she talked specifically about that the United States was committing itself to ensure to the greatest capacity, to the greatest extent it could, that for GLBT people to have the same human rights and protections afforded to others. She staked U.S. foreign policy on this commitment, urging that we must work here and in every region of the world to galvanize more support for the human rights of the LGBT community. And she announced the specific commitment of the United States. She said while she was giving the speech, that morning, President Obama put in place the first U.S. government strategy dedicated to combating human rights abuses against LGBT people abroad. putting together human rights funding, which is, the all-important issue in what the U.S. government does, as well as other resources, right? And you might think, okay, well, that's nice and that's good and that's fitting with the trajectory of how things change. But that is really something that is quite extraordinary, even if you look 5 years earlier, that we have this commitment of the United States, now in partnership with the Human Rights Office of the United Nations, making these changes. Now, despite these advances, which again were unimaginable to me when I started working on these issues in the early 1990s, enormous challenges remain for LGBT refugees and asylum seekers, including right here, right in Utica, where there are lots and lots of refugees, and around the country, and indeed around the world. Indeed, in a speech that was given just this past weekend, right, all of this, really what I'm talking to you about is very, very current. A senior official with the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees Office addressed a group of people at a conference, and the conference was called Invisible in the City, Urban Protection Gaps Facing Sexual Minorities Fleeing Persecution. The conference and the speech addressed the very problems faced by asylum seekers like Hasina and Rosa, who I talked to you about at the beginning of my remarks here, who are leaving friends and family, leaving as in a challenge faced by really any immigrant, right? Leaving home, leaving familiar customs, familiar food, leaving familiar language, and coming to a place where all of that or most of it is unfamiliar. Now, for most refugees can go to members of their community, right? If there are members of their community in where they live. So, for example, in New York City, where we have in Jackson Heights in Queens, it is said that there are more nationalities residing together in Queens, in Jackson Heights in particular, than probably any place else in the world. It means that most immigrants, most refugees coming, and immigrants and refugees are not the same. Refugees are people fleeing persecution. Immigrants is a much larger category of people who have left their home countries. Most refugees can find somebody from their country. And what does that mean? It means you can find a place to stay, usually. You can find maybe a link to a job. You maybe can find, if you have kids with you, some information about how to get education, about how to get health care, about how to access resources. But what do you do if you're an LGBT asylum seeker and you have fled your country specifically because you fear persecution? Right? How do you do that? How do you navigate that community? Do you stay in hiding again because you need that community to survive? Do you come out? And if you come out, what do you do? Right? Because then you can go try to seek help at the LGBT resource organizations, maybe who help people who are homeless or who help people in need of accessing resources, but often who have no idea how to handle the particular needs and issues relating to refugees. Now, I'm sure it won't surprise you that the needs are grave and that the resources are few, and this presents the enormous challenge, which is why Invisible in the City is quite an apt title. So on this last point, let me just turn back actually to Hillary Clinton's speech to the United Nations, and actually to another human rights leader who she invoked in her speech, Eleanor Roosevelt. And as many of you probably know, Eleanor Roosevelt frequently made the point when she was speaking around the world about human rights, that these rights begin in the small places close to home. The streets where people live, the schools they attend, the factories, farms, and offices where they work. These places are your domain. The actions you take, the ideals you advocate, can determine whether human rights flourish where you are. And which is an important reminder that even when you all are in the middle of a college campus, and you're swamped with homework, and hopefully with a little bit of fun in between, but you're not so close to the isolation and to the challenges that are plaguing LGBT refugees, that by sharing information, by sharing what you're learning, by getting a little bit involved, you also will make your contribution toward addressing these problems and toward making meaningful change for LGBT refugees. So let me stop there, and I'll be happy to talk and answer your questions or get your thoughts. we have a habit in law school of calling on people, but I don't have a seating chart or your last name, so I will just be kinder than that.
Yeah, one question I have, when you're up there arguing for your clients, who's on the other side? Like, is it the United States government? Is it the countries that these people are coming from? Who's on the other side?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when somebody seeks asylum, and they go initially, if they're not already in deportation proceedings, they go to the asylum officer. Nobody's on the other side. And the only question is whether they have demonstrated a well-founded fear of persecution. And try to remind me, I want to come back to the question about what if you're a college student and you never had it, you left home before you experienced persecution, but I don't want to go there right now. So just the asylum officer listening and evaluating. Then when you get to the stage of an appeal, let's say you lose there, or you go in front of it, the next stage is the immigration judge. There, the United States government is on the other side. And sometimes the government says, look, we concede that this person has made their case, and so we're not going to oppose. More often, the government is saying this person either has not established a well-founded fear of persecution, they don't have evidence to support that, or they don't have evidence to show that they have a good enough reason for missing the one-year deadline. Let's say that the person loses, the asylum seeker loses again at the immigration judge stage. Then the case goes up further to a higher court, and again, it's the United States government on the other side through the Department of Homeland Security, the section that deals with immigration and asylum issues. And they have an interest in being discouraging, right? Because one of the big issues in immigration law that I'm sure all of you know about is the fear of floodgates, right? What happens if we allow all these people to seek asylum here? You know, what will happen? Will the country be overrun with LGBT refugees? For a lot of reasons that you're probably aware of, right? That is probably not a huge problem, and not because there's not a lot of persecution in the world. Right? But because people tend not to flee their home countries, right? There's a lot of downside to leaving your home country, even if you're in a lot of danger. Not only that, but you have to have a certain level of resources and wherewithal to be able to cross one border, cross another, and if you're not living in a country contiguous with the United States, which are only two, to be able to get here. And to get here as your first landing point, because if you stop in another country on the way, you have to apply for asylum to that country, not to this country. There are a few exceptions, but it's quite complicated. So, but then you ask, well, what about the other countries, right? What about, could Brazil show up in our Brazilian asylum case, or Mexico, or Jamaica, or Iran, or any place? And the answer is the other countries don't have a role. Why? Because this is part of United States law to provide a place of refuge to people who have fled persecution in these countries. Now, do the other countries ever submit briefs or anything or statements to counter what the determinations? No, they actually don't. But is the U.S. especially sensitive to granting asylum to, say, asylum seekers from Mexico? Absolutely, right? I mean, to think, in my view at least, to think that these decisions get made outside of any consideration of foreign policy would be a little bit naive. On the other hand, there are asylum grants made to people from, for example, Mexico, and sometimes from other countries where you might be surprised to see that happening. And let me go back and answer the other question that I raised, but I really want you, if you have more questions, to ask them too. But what about this, right? What about the person who came to the U.S., say, when they were 17 for college, 18, and they were maybe deeply closeted, or maybe they had no idea they were gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. They get here, they come out in some respect, they start to learn about how dangerous their home country is. Can they obtain asylum? They never got beaten up by anybody at home. So think back to what the law said, right? The law requires you to either have had a history of persecution, and that is a very significant history, or a well-founded fear of persecution. So you don't have to have suffered that kind of persecution in order to make an asylum application. But you do have to have a well-founded fear. So sometimes asylum officers will say, well, how are they going to know you're gay, right? Well, who would know? just keep it quiet. And that's been a real point of contention in some of the litigation around these issues. And the answer to that question is the whole point of the law is to say this isn't something that you should have to hide, right? This isn't a part of your identity that you should have to change in order to survive. Mostly, and especially with this new guidance from the United States government, that sort of tendency to not grant asylum applications for people who haven't proven their particular danger is working, but it's tenuous, and it really varies country to country. People who are more gender conforming, who look less gay, get questioned a lot more as well. We had a client who, on the street wouldn't have sort of stood out obviously as a lesbian, and the asylum officers are often quite skeptical. Because the immigration bar, meaning the group of lawyers who handle immigration, is one of those groups where there are some fantastic lawyers and some really awful lawyers who take a lot of advantage of very vulnerable people. And there have been some lawyers who have said to their clients, sort of amazing to me, oh, go say you're gay, and then that will get you asylum. That's easier than political opinion. It's not true, first of all. In case you're thinking of passing that advice on to anybody. But I think what happened in some asylum offices is that there was sort of a little bit of a mini, not a stream really, like a rivulet of people who weren't really gay coming in and saying they were gay and feared persecution on that basis, and that generated a fair amount of skepticism. I don't think that's a big issue anymore, from what I understand. On the other hand, I also had, and this was back when I did that training in the asylum office in New York, an asylum officer, a week after the training, called me and said, she was like, I am from New York City, but I don't have the accent to reproduce like the thick, wonderful Queen's accent that she had. But she said, I had this kid in my office, and he's telling me some kind of made-up story about religious persecution, and I kept saying to him, is that all? Is that all? Is that all? Because I knew there was something there, and he just wasn't saying it. And finally, in their interview, he said, and I'm gay. And she said, oh! And then they had this whole big conversation, and she eventually granted his application. But it took a combination of knowledge on her part and information, and also a lot of patience and willingness to be accessible to this particular asylum seeker, as well as some courage on the part of the asylum seeker to think that by admitting this fact about himself, that he wasn't going to be putting himself in more danger. Any other questions?
I was wondering, when you're bringing these cases out, does the opposite side, do they take into account if the individual is, say, illiterate in both English and in their language, and maybe they didn't make the deadline because they can't communicate, and they can't fill out an application, do they take this into account?
Yeah, no, it's also a great question, because you think they should, right? But no, it's your obligation to figure these things out or to find somebody who can help you figure it out. And of course, if you're not literate, either in maybe your own country's language or English, and let's say you don't have access to the web, although you can go to the public library if you dare, right? How are you supposed to get the information, the documentation about the country conditions, the risk of persecution that will help you support your case? So it's a very, very tough situation, and it's really what you've asked about is why most asylum seekers lose. Because if you have a lawyer or you have an advocate, and you all could actually help people do this. You don't have to be a lawyer to provide assistance to somebody. If you go on the Immigration Equality website, it explains how to do this. You can't hold yourself out as a lawyer, so don't ever do that. But you can absolutely help somebody gather documentation, put together an affidavit, which is their sworn statement, their story about why they have a well-founded fear of persecution. But if you don't have somebody helping you, it's very, very hard to do. You can go in and tell your story, and telling your story should be enough, right? It's not like court. I mean, you don't have to have a fancy briefcase and a lot of documentation, but you have to be able to be very detailed in your story as an asylum seeker, if that's all you have, to persuade the asylum officer that you're telling the truth and that you have a well-founded fear. They do have resources in their office about every country in the world, both related to, now they have them related to sexual orientation and gender identity. They've traditionally always had them related to race, political opinion, religion, and national origin. And so they have these files, but some asylum officers want to do the work and figure it out for you, for the client, for the applicant, and some don't. So this is something you could be very helpful for people in doing. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, what would the process be like to seek asylum to those people who aren't, potentially couldn't even get a visa to come to the United States in the first place? I was just wondering, maybe there's a way to apply for a visa, like, for example, if you're coming from, I know Malaysia, I had a friend from Malaysia who wasn't allowed in the United States, just because he couldn't get a visa to get here.
Yeah, and actually, people from many of the countries from which people are seeking asylum for sexual orientation and gender identity persecution can't get visas, right? And for lots of people, if you don't have enough resources, say a bank account in your home country, you're not getting a visa, not because you're GLBT, but because the government suspects that you won't return. And unless you have established roots, which often include financial roots in your home country, and especially if you're young, the government, by the government I mean the US government, denies visa applications all the time. So what can people do? People can actually apply for asylum abroad. And actually, I've used the word refugee here as well as asylum seeker. A refugee is somebody who's not in the country, right, outside the United States seeking refuge here. Somebody seeking asylum from within the United States is called an asylum seeker. So they can apply, but it's a risky, scary thing to do because on the one hand, people are trying to stay hidden to protect themselves, and on the other, they have to be out enough to be able to make the application. Other questions?
Is there work being done on trying to change the 1-year deadline, or is that kind of accepted?
Yeah, that's a good question too, right? Is there more being done to try to change the 1-year deadline? Not enough, in my opinion. And I mean, surely you're all very well aware of how volatile immigration issues are in the United States. I mean, the Congress couldn't even pass, the DREAM Act, right? I mean, so immigration issues, the recent change is because President Obama made a change through the executive branch, not because Congress changed the law. So there is, in order for the 1-year deadline to be changed, Congress actually has to make a change to immigration law. Certainly not something that's happening before the election. I mean, Congress is basically back in Washington for about, I don't know, I think 5 days before the election. Mostly they're campaigning right now, members are. But not enough, frankly. I think the reason is, and you can imagine, and it's always useful when you think about, well, why is something not changing when it seems so obvious that this is really quite harsh? Because imagine making the argument, right? You make the argument, let's loosen up this 1-year deadline. Let's at least make it a 5-year deadline. What will the argument be on the other side? You want to open the floodgates invite and encourage all of these people to come to the United States so that they can manufacture these fake asylum applications over the course of 5 years. I mean, I'm putting it pretty harshly, but when you think about what a member of Congress is going to be willing to stake his or her reputation on, they have to be willing to wade into those waters, and that's a very tough fight. I think it could change as part of comprehensive immigration reform, but then it's just a question of when we're getting that. Are there other questions? I think I've taken the time here, so thank you. Those were great questions, and if you're interested in any of these issues, you can find a ton of information on the website of Immigration Equality as a starting point, and that will lead you to many others.
All right, can we give a big round of applause? So, one of the things I really wanted to ask you was your career path and how you ended up here, but how about this? We are a small enough group, and I think I ordered enough food. If you would like to just come and join us for dinner with Professor Goldberg, we're going to head over to the Days-Massolo Center now, and we have some food from Bamboo coming. Hopefully it'll be there by the time we get there.
You want to
As a
have a little
special advisor,
conversation?
I can talk to you about the Supreme Court's marriage document.
Can they ask you about Columbia Law School? Is
And
there?
about Columbia Law School,
Okay.
about law studies, anything you like.
Okay, so if you want to come over.